Ezra, let's start at the beginning and the gestation of this project. You had worked for HBO and ESPN, doing some of those wonderful 30 for 30 films at ESPN. And then a man named Connor Schell knocked on your door, and what did he say?
He said, and Connor Schell is the executive vice president of ESPN Films, and he created the 30 for 30 series along with a couple other people. And he said, you know, we've done like 80 films in the last 6 years, and I want to do something more ambitious, and I'm thinking about, I want to do a 5-hour film. And I was like, I want to do a 5-hour film. That sounds challenging. And that was like he got me on that. I was like, that's different. Right. And then I was like, oh yeah, but what about what? And he said about OJ. And I said, I don't want to do that. Like, no way.
Why?
What else is there to say about that? You know, we all lived through it. And it was, you know, I know what it's about. Even beyond the sort of, even though the things I wasn't interested in, I already knew what it was about. Like, there's a discussion that had taken place in too many places across this country to feel that at this point in time, there was really anything revelatory to say. Not to mention, I think instinctively as a filmmaker, I got how many people had tried to do things, let alone how many books had been written. And it's kind of like, no one really wants to talk about this. I don't know what new there is to say, so no. And I went away, and I happened to be going to Los Angeles the day after that conversation. And I have a lot of friends there, and I say, I had this conversation, they asked me to do this thing, and almost, you know, to a man or a woman, they were like, are you crazy? Like, that's actually what that's about, is exactly what you do. Like, this project's made for you. And sort of what got me sort of there in my mind was, well, I'm not interested in a film about sort of the further investigation into the murder and or his guilt. But what I am interested in, I like history, I'm interested in race, I know I'm interested in sports, and I knew enough about sort of OJ's trajectory to know that, oh, he's a guy, he showed up at USC when he did in the late 60s, I understand what kind of place USC is, I understand where it's located in Los Angeles, I understand it's a year and a half after Watts, I know this story is about what it's about as far as the LAPD. And so I'm going, oh, if I can tell a story that traces this history and involves all this other stuff, okay, that's compelling to me. Like, I could spend some time exploring this story.
Tell me, you grew up here in Washington. Tell us a little bit about your personal connection to the events of the film. I mean, was the verdict, do you remember where you were the day the verdict came down and what it meant to you?
Don't we all? I do, but it's not interesting.
Okay.
I was in college, I was a senior in college, and I don't remember following the trial at all. I actually remember the two moments. I remember the Bronco chase, right, and I remember the verdict, and that's it. And the day of the verdict, I was like, I mean, I think I was abroad for one semester during the trial or during that, so I was not focusing on it, but I obviously knew that this thing was taking place. And I just went home to my apartment by myself, watched the verdict, and was like, okay. And then I went back to class, and I went to class.
Were you struck at the time in terms of the diametrically, that dramatically, that searing difference in terms of the reactions?
I was aware of how I was emotionally pulled. I was not that engaged by the details of the case.
Right.
I just wanted him to be acquitted.
You wanted him to be acquitted?
Based on the history of sort of injustice, I was pulling for that. I don't think, I mean, seriously, if we were talking, it's embarrassing. If we were talking to my 21-year-old self, and someone said, like, I don't know that it'd be like, oh yeah, there's 6 blood drops, you know, sort of, you know, walking away from the body, and there's blood. I don't think I would have been that hip to what the specific evidence was. I just was like, I still existed emotionally in a place where I wanted it to be, like I wanted him to be innocent without having focused on it, but I was more swayed by the history of injustice and in that sort of, in a little bit of that cliche idea of like wanting a victory.
So we're at the Investigative Journalism Conference. Do you consider yourself a journalist or a filmmaker or both? Or
I was asked this question the other day. It was like, do you consider this film a work of journalism? And like, however paradoxical that sounds, but like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not like, I have a background as a journalist and I deal in truth and I deal in like, everything about how I approached this film was based on the rules in which the way I go and gather material and convey it, that I have an interest in sort of telling a story in a certain engaged manner. Yeah, I do, but I sort of, I don't know if I struggled with it, but I've never been able to answer the question about what is the sort of, what's the line between journalism and filmmaking, and where you're allowed to sort of take liberties as a filmmaker that sort of cease to make something that it no longer is journalistically sound. I think everything about this film is journalistically sound, and purposely so. I don't think you can do I also think in a case like this, you cannot, in a story like this, it's so known that I think if you sort of took any liberties, you'd get called out pretty quickly. And so, yeah, I mean, so do I consider it a work of journalism? I don't know what the right answer is. It's a film that has its foundation in the world of journalism.
did you approach OJ to be in the film?
I wrote him an email.
And?
I didn't hear back.
Do you happen to know if he's seen it?
I don't. I do. I thought for a while he had, because I know from what I understand. I don't know. I understand that he has a TV in his cell and he has cable, as a lot of the inmates do at that prison. And then we got a cryptic email a couple months after it aired from the prison, where it sent to ESPN saying, "Can you please let us know when you have plans to re-air this film, because we want to tell the cable system to shut it down." So people, and so then I thought, oh, maybe they've seen it, like, and he's seen it. But then this is all I know. Then the LA Times wrote an article a couple weeks ago talking about him, and they have a whole thing about that, and the people in the prison said no one was allowed to watch it. I don't know how they control that.